The signal came without warning on a Tuesday morning in the year 2347, and it arrived on every screen, every speaker, every device that humanity had ever built across 14 star systems. It was not a greeting. It was not a question. It was an order. The Valith Dominion had entered human space with 9,000 warships, and their supreme arbiter, a towering creature named Kael'vrith whose body was covered in bone-white plates and whose 4 eyes burned like dying stars, spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had done this 200 times before. Because he had. Species designate. Human, the translation software rendered his words in a flat, cold tone. You have been assessed and catalogued by the Eyeless Court, the intelligence division of the Valith Dominion, and you have been found to be a pre-ascendant civilization of minor strategic value but acceptable biological utility, and you are hereby issued a submission decree under the authority of the Dominion, which grants you 72 standard hours to disarm all military vessels, dissolve all governing bodies, and present your population for biological cataloging and reassignment to servitude roles as determined by the Dominion. He paused and his 4 eyes blinked slowly, one pair at a time. Failure to comply will result in the total extinction of your species, as has been carried out against 17 others who refused the mercy of submission, and refusal is not recommended. The signal ended. Across 14 star systems, 8 billion humans sat in silence for exactly 11 seconds. Then the panic began. On Earth, the United Interstellar Council was already in emergency session before the signal finished broadcasting, because their deep space sensors had detected the Valith fleet 6 hours earlier, and they had spent those 6 hours arguing about what to do. The council chamber in Geneva was a grand room built of old stone and new metal, and it was filled with the leaders and representatives of every human colony, every nation-state, every corporate territory, and every military branch that existed under the umbrella of human civilization, and every single one of them was terrified. President Adjora Mensa of the Earth Union stood at the central podium, and she was a small woman with gray hair and steady hands, but her voice shook when she spoke. We have received the Valith terms, she said, and I want to be honest with everyone in this room about our situation, because the situation is very bad. She pulled up a display that showed the Valith fleet in comparison to humanity's combined naval forces, and the difference was so extreme that several delegates actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because the alternative was screaming. Humanity had roughly 1,200 warships spread across 14 systems, most of them light frigates and patrol cruisers designed for anti-piracy work, and the Valith had 9,000 capital-class warships, each one larger and more powerful than anything humanity had ever put into space. We are outgunned, President Mensa said, by a factor that I do not even want to say out loud. The room erupted into shouting, and for 20 minutes it was chaos, with some delegates demanding immediate surrender, others calling for negotiation, and a small but loud group insisting that humanity should fight even if it meant extinction. It was during this chaos that Fleet Admiral Renat Okonkwo stood up from her seat in the military section of the chamber, and the room did not fall silent because of her rank or her reputation, but because of the look on her face. She was not afraid. She was not angry. She looked like someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Admiral Okonkwo was 57 years old, tall and lean with dark skin and close-cropped silver hair, and she had served in the human fleet for 34 years, and she had spent the last 15 of those years running a program that almost nobody in the room knew existed. Madam President, she said, and her voice was calm and clear and carried to every corner of the chamber without amplification. I need to brief the council on a classified program. President Mensa stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. Admiral Okonkwo walked to the central display and entered a code that, even the president did not recognize. And the display changed to show something that made the entire room go quiet in a way that the Valith signal had not managed. The display showed shipyards. Hidden shipyards. Hundreds of them, buried inside asteroids, concealed in the rings of gas giants, tucked into the cold, dark spaces between stars where nobody ever looked, and every single one of them was full of warships that did not appear on any official registry. 112 years ago, Admiral Okonkwo began, humanity intercepted its first Valith communication, and our cryptographers spent 11 years breaking their encryption. And when they finally read those messages, they learned something that changed everything. She looked around the room. They learned that the galaxy is not a friendly place, and that every species out there either conquers or gets conquered, and that the Valith Dominion had been expanding in our direction for centuries, and that it was not a question of if they would come for us but when. She tapped the display, and the hidden shipyards opened like flowers, revealing the ships inside them. So a very small group of people within the military and intelligence community made a decision, and they started building, and they never stopped, and they never told anyone outside the program because they knew that if the secret got out, the Valith would come before we were ready. The room was so quiet that the hum of the ventilation system sounded like thunder. The program is called Project Gehenna, Admiral Okonkwo said, and it has been the single largest military undertaking in human history, funded through black budgets and hidden accounts and shell corporations for over a century, and it has produced a fleet and a weapons arsenal that I believe will allow us to fight the Valith Dominion and win. President Mensa found her voice first. How many ships? She asked. Admiral Okonkwo told her. The number was so large that several delegates had to ask her to repeat it, and when she did, a few of them started crying, not from fear but from the sheer overwhelming relief of learning that someone, somewhere, had been planning for this nightmare. The ships are not pretty, Admiral Okonkwo said, and for the first time a small smile crossed her face. They are not elegant and they are not graceful, and the Valith would probably consider them ugly. But they are tough and they are mean and they are built to take a beating and keep fighting, which is more than I can say for anything the Valith have ever faced. She turned to President Mensa. Madam President, I am asking for authorization to activate Project Gehenna and to engage the Valith Dominion with everything we have. The debate that followed lasted 4 hours, and it was the most important 4 hours in human history, and at the end of it, the vote was not unanimous, but it was overwhelming. Humanity would fight. Admiral Okonkwo returned to her command ship, the UIS Defiance, and she sat in her chair on the bridge, and she opened a communication channel to the Valith flagship, and she knew that Kael'vrith would be watching, and she knew that he expected tears or pleading or the quiet acceptance of a species that understood it was beaten. Instead, she sent 6 words. Humanity does not kneel, leave now. The Valith communication officers forwarded the message to Kael'vrith, and the Supreme Arbiter read it twice because he was certain the translation software had made an error. When he confirmed the translation was accurate, he laughed. It was a deep, rumbling sound that echoed through the command deck of his flagship, and his officers laughed with him, because in 2,000 years of conquest, no species had ever refused a submission decree, and the idea that these small, soft, short-lived creatures thought they could fight the Dominion was the funniest thing any of them had ever heard. Kael'vrith ordered the countdown timers to continue. 72 hours, he thought, and then these humans would learn what every other species had learned before them. He was wrong about that. He was very, very wrong. The activation signal for Project Gehenna traveled at faster-than-light speeds through a network of hidden relay beacons that had been planted across human space over the course of a century, and when it reached its destinations, things began to wake up. Terrible things. In the asteroid belt of the Sol system, a rock designated KR-441 that had been listed in every mining database as depleted and abandoned, split open along a seam that no scanner had ever detected. And from inside it came warships, one after another, sliding out of the hollowed interior like bullets from a magazine, each one painted black and running without transponders. In orbit around Titan, the ice cracked, and from beneath the frozen surface rose a weapons platform the size of a small city that had been sleeping under the moon's crust for 40 years, waiting for a signal that its builders hoped would never come. In the Uit cloud, far beyond the reach of any Valeth sensor, the largest secret shipyard in human history powered up its lights for the first time in a decade, and the workers who had lived there in isolation for years finally learned why they had spent their lives building ships they were told would never be used. All across 14 star systems, the same thing happened, and the scale of it was almost impossible to understand. Admiral Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the Defiance and watched the reports come in on her command display. And even she, who had spent 15 years running this program, felt her breath catch at the sheer size of what humanity had built in secret. The first fleet to fully assemble was the Iron Requiem. It was the backbone of the Gehenna arsenal, 1,200 dreadnoughts each measuring over 2 kilometers long, and they were the ugliest warships ever built by any species in the galaxy, covered in angular armor plates and bristling with weapons that stuck out at odd angles like the spines of some deep-sea creature. The Valeth built their ships to be beautiful, with sweeping curves and polished hulls that reflected starlight like mirrors, because they believed that war was a form of art and that a warship should inspire awe in those it was about to destroy. Humanity built the Iron Requiem to survive. Every ship had triple redundant power systems, meaning you had to kill the same ship 3 times before it stopped fighting, and every ship carried enough missiles, railgun rounds, and nuclear warheads to reduce a continent to glass, and every ship was designed with the assumption that it would take catastrophic damage and keep going, because the humans who designed them understood something that the Valeth never had to learn. When you are the smaller force, you cannot afford to lose a ship and have it stay lost, so you build ships that refuse to die. The second major asset to come online was the Ragnarok Station network. These were weapons platforms hidden in deep space, far from any star or planet, drifting in the void where nobody would ever think to look, and each one was essentially a giant electromagnetic cannon capable of accelerating a tungsten rod the size of a building to 90% of the speed of light. A rod moving at that speed carried more energy than a nuclear bomb, and it crossed the distance between stars in a matter of hours, and there was no shield in the galaxy that could stop it because nothing in the galaxy was designed to stop something moving that fast. The Ragnarok stations had been built as a deterrent, a weapon so terrible that its mere existence was supposed to prevent war. But now the war had come anyway, and Admiral Okonkwo authorized them for active deployment with a hand that did not shake. The third asset was the one that the Valeth would come to fear more than anything else. They were called the Locusts. They were tiny machines, each one no bigger than a human fist, and they were self-replicating, meaning that each one could use raw material to build copies of itself, and they were designed to land on enemy ships and eat them. Not damage them, not disable them, eat them. The Locusts would attach to a hull, break down the metal at a molecular level, and use the material to build more Locusts, which would then spread to other ships, and the process would continue until there was nothing left but a cloud of tiny machines looking for their next meal. They were, by any reasonable standard, a horror, and the scientists who designed them had included multiple kill switches and failsafes, because they understood that they were creating something that could consume an entire fleet if left unchecked. And finally, there were the Heldivers. The Heldiver Marines were not a weapon system but a fighting force, 10,000 men and women trained for the single most dangerous form of combat in the galaxy, boarding actions in hard vacuum. Every other species in the galaxy considered boarding actions to be insane, because fighting inside a spaceship while the ship was in the middle of a battle, while the vacuum of space was on the other side of every wall, was a level of risk that no rational being would accept. The Heldovers accepted it gladly. They wore powered armor that could survive direct exposure to space. They carried weapons designed to kill without puncturing hulls, and they trained in conditions so brutal that the washout rate was 80%. And the ones who survived were the most dangerous close combat fighters humanity had ever produced. They did not fight to capture ships. They fought to kill everyone on board and then fly the ship themselves, and they had practiced doing exactly that on simulated Valith vessels for decades. All of this, every ship and weapon and soldier, had been built and trained and hidden in secret for over a century, and now it was all waking up at once, and the combined force of Project Gehenna was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen from a species as young as humanity. On the Valith flagship, the officers of the eyeless court were watching their sensors with growing confusion. They had expected to see humanity's small official fleet gathering in a defensive formation around Earth, the predictable last stand of a doomed species, but instead they were detecting energy signatures and ship movements that did not match any of their intelligence. Supreme Arbiter, the chief intelligence officer reported, his bone-white plates clicking nervously. We are detecting significantly more vessels than our projections indicated. Kael'vrith did not look up from his command throne. How many more? He asked. The intelligence officer hesitated, and then he said a number, and then he corrected that number upward, and then he corrected it again, because the data kept changing as more and more hidden assets came online. Our probability model for human surrender has been updated, the officer said, and his voice was careful and neutral in the way that Valith officers spoke when they were delivering bad news. It has dropped from 99.7% to 64%. Kael'vrith finally looked up. 64% is still a majority, he said. Yes, Supreme Arbiter, but the number is still falling. Over the next several hours, the eyeless court updated their projections 17 times, and each update was worse than the last, and by the end the probability of human surrender had fallen to 7%, a number so low that it essentially meant the humans were going to fight no matter what. Kael'vrith studied the data for a long time, and then he dismissed it with a wave of one armored hand. No young species has ever resisted us, he said. Their ships are crude, their technology is inferior, and their lives are short. And short-lived creatures do not have the courage to face extinction, because they value each of their brief years too much to throw them away. His officers nodded, because the Supreme Arbiter was always right, because he had conquered 200 species, because the Valith Dominion had never lost. But deep in the bowels of the flagship, one junior analyst of the eyeless court sat alone at her station and stared at the data, and felt something she had never felt before in her career. She felt afraid, because the numbers were telling her something that the Supreme Arbiter refused to hear, which was that humanity had not spent a century building weapons in secret because they were afraid of dying. They had done it because they had already decided they would rather die than kneel. And a species that has already made peace with its own death is the most dangerous thing in the universe. The 72-hour clock continued to count down, and across human space, the Doomsday Armada finished assembling, and Admiral Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked at the fleet she had spent her life building, and she allowed herself one moment of something that might have been pride. Then the clock hit 0. She opened a channel to the Valith fleet, and her face appeared on the screen of every Valith ship, and she spoke 7 words that would be remembered for as long as the galaxy existed. Time is up, but not for us. The Doomsday Armada began its advance, and the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. Ceolfrith ordered his fleet forward, with the confidence of a predator that had never met anything it could not kill. And 9,000 Valith warships moved toward the Sol system in a formation that was ancient and proven, and had broken every enemy it had ever faced. The formation was called the Tide, and it was simple in concept but devastating in practice. The fleet spread wide across millions of kilometers of space, creating a wall of ships that advanced together, so that no matter where the enemy tried to run, there was nowhere to go. It had crushed 200 species. It would not crush the 201st. The Valith entered the outer edges of the Sol system and found nothing waiting for them, and this was the first thing that confused Ceolfrith, because every species he had ever fought had positioned their fleet between his ships and their homeworld in a desperate defensive line, and the humans had not done this. There was only empty space. They are hiding, Ceolfrith decided. They have realized the foolishness of their defiance, and they are hiding their ships behind their planets and moons, hoping we will not find them. He ordered the fleet deeper into the system. They crossed the orbit of Neptune, and there was nothing. They passed Uranus, and there was nothing. They moved through the asteroid belt, and there was nothing. And by this point, even Ceolfrith's most loyal officers were beginning to feel uneasy, because the silence was wrong. It was the silence of a trap. Admiral Okonkwo sat in her command chair on the Defiance, which was positioned behind the dark side of a captured asteroid 3 billion kilometers from the Valith fleet, and she watched the enemy ships on her tactical display, and she waited. She had drawn a line in the battle plan, a boundary that existed only in the computers of the human fleet, and she had called it the Red Line, and it was positioned exactly where she wanted the Valith to be when everything happened. The Valith fleet crossed the Red Line at 1400 hours, Sol Standard Time. Admiral Okonkwo said one word. Now. The Ragnarok stations fired first. 6 stations, hidden in the deep void far outside the solar system, launched their tungsten rods simultaneously, and the rods accelerated to 90% of light speed in seconds and crossed the distance to the Valith fleet in minutes, and they arrived before the light of their launching did, which meant that the Valith had no warning at all. The first rod hit a Valith carrier directly through its center, and the ship simply ceased to exist, converted instantly from 2 kilometers of advanced warship into an expanding cloud of superheated gas and shrapnel that tore into the ships around it. 5 more rods hit in the same second, and 6 capital ships died without ever knowing they were under attack. Before the Valith could even process what had happened, the Iron Requiem fleet arrived. 1,200 human dreadnoughts dropped out of faster-than-light travel inside the Valith formation, and this was a maneuver that every naval textbook in the galaxy said was impossible, because FTL jumps were imprecise over short distances, and jumping into the middle of an enemy fleet meant you might materialize inside another ship. The humans did it anyway. They had spent decades calculating the exact jump coordinates, and they had built their FTL drives to be more precise than anything the Valith had ever seen, not because human technology was superior, but because human engineers had been told that the lives of their entire species depended on getting this right, and that kind of motivation produces results. The Iron Requiem ships appeared among the Valith fleet like wolves materializing inside a flock of sheep, and they opened fire immediately at point-blank range, and the Valith long-range weapons that were their greatest advantage became useless because you cannot use a sniper rifle when the enemy is close enough to bite you. The battle became a brawl, close and brutal and ugly, exactly the kind of fight that humanity had designed its ships for. Valith warships were elegant and powerful, but they were built for long-range combat, for destroying enemies at a distance with precise, beautiful volleys of energy weapons, and at close range their thin, Graceful hulls cracked under the impact of human railguns that fired chunks of metal at speeds that turned them into something close to small nuclear explosions. The human ships took terrible damage too, but the Iron Requiem dreadnoughts had been built to absorb punishment, and when one system failed, there were two more behind it, and the ships kept fighting even when they were burning, even when entire sections were open to space, even when by any reasonable standard they should have been dead. Then the locusts arrived. Cargo pods that had been scattered across the battle space weeks earlier cracked open and released their contents, and billions of tiny machines poured out into the void and began looking for enemy hulls, and when they found them they latched on and began to eat. The Veilith had never seen anything like the locusts, and they had no defense against them, because how do you fight a machine the size of a fist that is eating your ship from the outside while you are trying to fight a battle? And the locusts spread from ship to ship, carried by the debris and shrapnel that filled the battle space, and every ship they touched began to die slowly as its hull was consumed. And then the Heldivers launched. Boarding torpedoes fired from the Iron Requiem ships, each one carrying a squad of 10 armored Marines, and the torpedoes punched through Veilith hulls, and the Marines poured out into the alien corridors and began fighting. The Veilith were larger than humans, stronger than humans, and their bone plate armor made them resistant to most small arms fire, but the Heldivers were not carrying small arms. They carried weapons that had been specifically designed to kill Veilith, tested on captured specimens and refined over decades, and they fought with a ferocity that the Veilith had never encountered, because no species had ever been insane enough to board a warship during a battle before. The Veilith soldiers fought back with everything they had, and they were not cowards, but they were fighting an enemy that did not retreat and did not surrender and did not seem to care about dying, and that kind of enemy breaks something inside you that training cannot fix. Within 4 hours of the red line being crossed, the Veilith had lost 2,000 ships. 2,000 ships gone, destroyed or consumed or captured, and the battle was not slowing down. It was getting worse, because every minute that passed meant more locust swarms spreading and more boarding actions succeeding, and more human ships arriving from hidden positions throughout the system. On the bridge of his flagship, Kael'vrith watched the tactical display and saw something that no Supreme Arbiter had seen in 600 years. He saw his fleet losing. Not a close battle, not a tactical setback, but a genuine, catastrophic defeat unfolding in real time, and he could not understand how this was happening because these were humans. These were soft little creatures who lived for less than a century and who had only been in space for a few hundred years, and they were tearing his fleet apart. "Supreme Arbiter," his fleet commander said, and the officer's voice was shaking, "I recommend immediate tactical withdrawal to regroup and reassess." A tactical withdrawal. A retreat. No Supreme Arbiter had ordered a retreat in 600 years, and Kael'vrith knew that if he gave this order it would shatter something fundamental about the Veilith Dominion, because the Dominion was built on the belief that it could not be beaten, and once that belief was broken it could never be repaired. But the alternative was the destruction of his fleet, and dead ships could not conquer anything. "All ships," Kael'vrith said, and the words tasted like poison in his mouth, "withdraw." The Veilith fleet turned and ran, and for the first time in 2,000 years of conquest, the Dominion fled from a species it had come to subjugate. But Admiral Okonkwo was not finished. Every other species the Veilith had fought had been content to survive, to hold their ground and watch the enemy leave and count their blessings. But Okonkwo was not interested in survival. She was interested in victory. "All ships," she said, and her voice was iron, "pursue." The Doomsday Armada chased the Veilith fleet across 3 star systems, harrying them like wolves chasing wounded prey, and across the galaxy, on monitoring stations and listening posts and diplomatic vessels. Hundreds of species watched the sensor data in absolute silence. The pre-ascendant primitives were chasing the most powerful fleet in the quadrant. Nobody spoke. Nobody could think of anything to say. The galaxy would never be the same. The news of the Battle of the Red Line spread across the galaxy faster than any fleet could travel, carried by diplomatic channels and intelligence networks, and the sheer disbelief of species that had spent centuries accepting the Valeth Dominion as an unstoppable force of nature. On 100 different worlds, on space stations and colony ships and hidden outposts, beings of every shape and size heard the same impossible story. The humans had fought the Valeth and won. Not just won, but chased them. The reaction was not uniform, because the galaxy was a complicated place, full of complicated species, with complicated feelings about the dominion that had ruled over so many of them for so long. On the vassal worlds, the species that had surrendered to the Valeth generations ago and had lived under their boot ever since, the reaction was something that had not been felt in living memory. It was hope. On the world of Kethari Prime, where the insectoid Kethari had served as Valeth laborers for 300 years, a work crew stopped in the middle of their shift and refused to continue. And when the Valeth overseers demanded they return to their duties, the workers simply stood and stared at them, and there were a lot more workers than overseers. On the ocean moon of Pellucid, the aquatic Drenari who had been forced to harvest rare minerals from their own sacred reefs sent a message to the nearest human diplomatic station that contained only 2 words: "We remember." Nobody was quite sure what they meant by that, but the Valeth garrison on Pellucid suddenly found themselves very nervous. On a dozen vassal worlds, similar things began to happen. Small acts of defiance that individually meant nothing but collectively represented something enormous. The idea that the Valeth could be beaten had cracked the foundation of the Dominion's power, because that power had always rested not on the strength of their fleet, but on the belief that resistance was pointless. The humans had proven it was not pointless, and you cannot put that kind of idea back in its box. The conquered of elder races, the ancient civilizations that had existed for tens of thousands of years, and who observed the younger species the way humans might observe ants, also took notice. The elder races rarely involved themselves in the affairs of what they called transient civilizations, but the Battle of the Red Line had caught their attention for a reason that had nothing to do with military strategy. A species barely 3 centuries into its interstellar existence had built a secret military arsenal capable of defeating a millennia-old empire, and it had done so without anyone noticing. The elder races found this deeply interesting and slightly alarming. They sent observers to human space, ancient ships that moved through the galaxy like ghosts, watching and recording and reporting back to councils that had existed since before the Valeth had learned to make fire. Meanwhile, humanity found itself suddenly popular. Diplomatic channels that had been silent for decades lit up with messages from species that had previously ignored or dismissed humans as irrelevant. And now everyone wanted to talk, everyone wanted to trade, everyone wanted an alliance with the species that had made the Valeth run. Admiral Okonkwo had no time for diplomacy, because she knew that the war was not over. She knew Kael'vrith, not personally but through decades of studying Valeth psychology and military doctrine, and she knew that the Supreme Arbiter would not accept defeat. The Valeth did not lose, it was the core of their identity, and when reality conflicted with that identity, the Valeth did not change their identity. They changed reality. The confirmation came 3 weeks after the Battle of the Red Line, when human intelligence intercepted a Valeth communication that made Admiral Okonkwo close her eyes and sit very still for a long time. Kael'vrith had authorized the deployment of the Scouring Fleet. The Scouring Fleet was not a military force in the traditional sense. It was an extinction weapon, a collection of ships designed for one purpose: the complete destruction of a planet's ability to support life, and it had been used 17 times in Valith history against species deemed too dangerous or too defiant to be allowed to exist. The scouring fleet did not invade, it did not conquer, it did not negotiate. It burned, and it was heading for the human colony world of New Cascadia. New Cascadia was a beautiful world, the third planet of a yellow star 40 light-years from Earth, with vast forests and deep blue oceans, and a population of 40 million people who had built their civilization in harmony with the alien ecosystem that surrounded them. It was also one of the most exposed human colonies, positioned at the edge of human space with only a small defensive garrison. Admiral Okonkwo sent everything she could spare, but the Doomsday Armada was spread across 14 systems, and the scouring fleet moved faster than anyone expected, and the ships she sent arrived too late. The defense of New Cascadia lasted 11 hours. The garrison fleet, 37 ships commanded by Commodore James Chen, knew from the moment they saw the scouring fleet that they could not win, but they fought anyway, because behind them were 40 million people trying to evacuate onto whatever ships could carry them. Commodore Chen ordered his ships into a formation that military historians would later call the Wall, a tight defensive line designed not to destroy the enemy but simply to be in the way, to force the scouring fleet to go through them before it could reach the planet. They went through ship by ship, and everyone that died bought another few minutes for the evacuation transports to lift off, and James Chen's ship was the last to fall, and his final transmission was the evacuation count. 31 million evacuated, 9 million still on the surface. The scouring fleet reached New Cascadia and did what it was designed to do. The bombardment lasted 2 hours, and when it was over, the forests were ash, the oceans were steam, and 9 million people were gone. The news hit humanity like a physical blow. On Earth, people wept in the streets, and on the colony worlds, people held vigils, and in the halls of the Interstellar Council, the fragile unity that the Battle of the Red Line had created began to crack. Some leaders called for negotiation, arguing that if the Valith could do this to one world, they could do it to all of them, and that continuing to fight would only mean more New Cascadias. Others called for escalation, for using the Ragnarok stations to strike at Valith homeworlds, for turning this into a war of mutual extinction if that was what it took. The coalition was fracturing, and Kael'vrith knew it, because this was exactly what the scouring fleet was designed to do, not just kill people but break the spirit of the survivors. Admiral Okonkwo requested a broadcast channel, and she was given one, and every human in 14 star systems heard what she said next. She did not give a speech about victory or defiance or the glory of battle, because she was not that kind of leader and this was not that kind of moment. Instead, she spoke quietly, almost softly, and she said the names. She said the names of the 9 million dead. Not all of them, because that would have taken years, but she read from a list for 7 minutes, name after name after name, and the silence between each name was heavier than any words could have been. Then she stopped, and she looked into the camera and she said, "These people did not die so that we could surrender, and they did not die so that we could burn the galaxy in revenge. They died because a species that has never been told no decided that our defiance deserved punishment. And if we stop now, if we kneel now, then they died for nothing, and I will not allow that." She paused. "I am authorizing the final contingency of Project Gehenna, the one we hoped we would never need, the one that even I do not fully understand." She took a breath. "It is called Operation Pale Horse, and it is the reason the Valith Dominion is going to lose this war." Deep in uncharted space, in a system with no name orbiting a star that appeared on no map, something responded to a signal it had been waiting to receive for 80 years. It was enormous, larger than any ship humanity had ever built, larger than anything the Valith had ever built, and it was old, far older than any civilization currently alive in the galaxy. Because it had not been built by any civilization currently alive in the galaxy. Humanity had found it drifting in the void 60 years ago, a derelict from a species that had existed and thrived and fought a war against something terrible and won, and then vanished without explanation, leaving behind only their tools. Humanity had spent 80 years studying it, reverse engineering what they could, understanding perhaps 10% of its capabilities, and they had given it a name from an old book about the end of the world. They called it the Pale Horse. And now it was awake. Its engines, which operated on principles that human physicists could describe mathematically but not explain conceptually, powered up with a sound that was felt rather than heard, a deep vibration that made the bones of the skeleton crew aboard it ache. Admiral Okonkwo received confirmation that the Pale Horse was operational, and she looked at the message for a long time, and she thought about 9 million people who would never see what happened next. "Bring it to Saul," she said. The Pale Horse moved, and space bent around it like water around a stone. Kael'vrith assembled everything the Valeth Dominion had left for one final strike, and the fleet that gathered at the edge of the Sol system was 4,000 ships strong, the largest concentration of Valeth military power in 3 centuries, and every single ship was pointed at Earth. He stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the blue and green world on his display, and he felt nothing for it, because to him it was simply a problem that needed to be solved, the way New Cascadia had been a problem, the way 200 other worlds had been problems before it. "Begin the advance," he said. The Valeth scouring fleet moved toward Earth, and between them and the planet stood the remains of humanity's Doomsday Armada. Admiral Okonkwo had gathered every ship she had left, and the fleet that faced the Valeth was smaller than it had been at the Battle of the Red Line, because ships had been lost and damaged and spread across the war, and the Iron Requiem dreadnoughts that remained bore the scars of weeks of fighting, their hulls patched and welded and held together in some cases by nothing more than stubbornness and engineering tape. But they were there, and they were not leaving. The battle began at range, with the Valeth firing their long-range energy weapons in the precise, elegant volleys that their species had perfected over millennia, and the human ships took the hits and kept coming, closing the distance the way they always did, turning every engagement into the close-range brawl that favored their heavy armor and brutal weapons. The fighting was savage from the first minute. Human dreadnoughts rammed Valeth cruisers when their weapons failed, using their own ships as battering rams, because if a ship was going to die anyway, it might as well take an enemy with it, and Heldiver boarding teams launched into the chaos, punching through alien hulls and fighting room by room through ships that were trying to kill them even as they were being consumed by locust swarms on the outside. The Valeth fought with the desperation of a species that understood what failure meant, because if they lost here their dominion would collapse as every vassal species they had ever conquered rose up at once, and the empire that had taken 2,000 years to build would come apart in a matter of months. Both sides were taking terrible losses, and the space between the fleets was filled with debris and bodies and the expanding clouds of destroyed ships, and for a time it seemed like the battle would end with the mutual destruction of both forces, which would leave Earth defenseless against whatever the Valeth sent next. Then the Pale Horse arrived. It did not drop out of faster-than-light travel the way normal ships did, with a flash of displaced energy and a brief distortion of local space. Instead, space itself seemed to fold inward, like a piece of paper being creased, and where the crease met itself the Pale Horse simply appeared, as if it had always been there and the universe had only just noticed. It was enormous. The ship, if it could even be called a ship, was over 50 kilometers long, and it was made of a material that human scientists had not been able to identify despite 80 years of study, something that was dark and smooth, and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, so that looking at it was like looking at a hole in the universe shaped like a vessel. Every sensor on every ship in both fleets detected it at the same moment, and for a few seconds the battle actually stopped, because both sides forgot they were trying to kill each other and simply stared at the impossible thing that had appeared among them. On the Valeth flagship, the sensor officers reported what they were detecting, and their voices were steady because they were professionals, but their hands were shaking because the readings made no sense. The Pale Horse was generating a gravitational field. Not the normal gravitational field that any large object generates, but an artificial, controlled gravitational field of a magnitude that should not have been possible, and it was growing stronger by the second. Admiral Okonkwo stood on the bridge of the Defiance, and she was closer to the Pale Horse than anyone, and even she felt a moment of pure awe at what she was seeing, because the skeleton crew aboard the ancient ship was doing something that her scientists had theorized was possible, but had never actually attempted. They were bending space. Not folding it for travel, not warping it for propulsion, but bending it around the Valeth fleet like a hand closing around a handful of sand, creating a gravitational cage that held every Valeth ship in place as gently and firmly as a parent holding a child. 4,000 Valeth warships stopped moving. Their engines still fired, their weapons still worked, their crews were still alive and unhurt, but they could not move, because the space around them had been curved into a closed loop, and no amount of thrust could carry them out of it. They were trapped perfectly and completely, without a single shot being fired. On the bridge of his flagship, Kael'vrith watched his tactical display show his entire fleet held motionless, and he understood what was happening, and more importantly, he understood what was not happening. The humans were not killing them. They had the power to crush every ship in his fleet like insects, to collapse the gravitational cage and compress 4,000 warships into a singularity no larger than a grain of sand, and they were choosing not to do it. This, Kael'vrith realized, was not a battle. It was a demonstration. Admiral Okonkwo opened a communication channel, and her face appeared on the screen of the Valeth flagship, and she looked tired because she was tired, because she had been fighting a war for weeks, and she had lost friends and ships and a colony of 9 million people, and she was not in the mood for speeches. "Supreme Arbiter," she said, "your fleet is immobilized, your empire is in revolt, and I am holding the lives of every being on those 4,000 ships in my hand." She paused. "I could close that hand, and we both know it." Kael'vrith said nothing, because there was nothing to say. "I am not going to do that," Okonkwo continued, "because unlike you, I did not come here to destroy a species. I came here to make sure mine survives, and my species does not survive by becoming the thing it fought against." She leaned forward. "Here are my terms. The Valeth Dominion will agree to an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. You will release every vassal species from servitude. You will pay reparations for the destruction of New Cascadia, and humanity will be recognized as a full sovereign civilization with a permanent seat on the Galactic Concord. And in exchange, your fleet goes home alive." Kael'vrith sat on his command throne and stared at the small human woman on his screen, and he thought about 2,000 years of conquest, and he thought about the 200 species that had knelt before him, and he thought about the fact that this one had not. "And if I refuse," he asked, "then your fleet stays in that cage until your crews run out of food," Okonkwo said, "and I have a lot more patience than you have supplies." The ceasefire was signed 6 hours later. It was the first ceasefire in Valeth history, and it was unconditional, and when the gravitational cage was released and the Valeth fleet limped home, the galaxy watched them go and understood that something fundamental had changed. The vassal species were freed, one by one, over the following months, and some of them had been in servitude for so long that they had forgotten what freedom felt like, and the process was messy and complicated and sometimes violent. But it happened. Humanity got its seat on the Galactic Concord, and when the human ambassador walked into the chamber for the first time, the representatives of 300 species rose to their feet, not in welcome, but in acknowledgement of something they had never expected to see. The pale horse was quietly decommissioned and returned to its hidden system, and officially it did not exist, and unofficially every intelligence agency in the galaxy knew exactly where it was and included it in every strategic calculation they would ever make. The elder races watched all of this with their ancient, patient eyes, and they updated their assessments of humanity, and the new assessment was not comfortable. Because a species that could wield the power to destroy an empire and chose mercy instead was not just dangerous. It was unpredictable. An unpredictable species changed the galaxy in ways that could not be controlled or anticipated, and the elder races had spent tens of thousands of years making sure the galaxy was controlled and anticipated. Humanity, they concluded, was going to be a problem. A fascinating problem, but a problem. 7 months after the war ended, a diplomatic vessel from the Cathari, one of the newly freed vassal species, arrived in orbit around Earth, and the Cathari ambassador, a small insectoid being with iridescent wings and gentle compound eyes, was brought to meet Admiral Okonkwo, who had retired from active service and was living in a small house on the coast of what used to be called West Africa. The ambassador sat across from her in the garden, and the sound of waves filled the silence between them. And after a long time, the ambassador asked the question that the entire galaxy wanted answered. Admiral, you had the power to destroy the Veilith completely, to end their civilization the way they ended so many others, and every species in the galaxy would have understood if you had done it after what they did to New Cascadia. The ambassador paused, choosing the next words carefully. Why did you not do it? Admiral Okonkwo looked out at the ocean, and the sunlight caught the gray in her hair, and she thought about James Chen and his 37 ships and the 9 million people whose names she had read aloud, and she thought about the soldiers she had lost and the ships that would never come home, and she thought about the Veilith crews trapped in that gravitational cage who had looked out their windows and seen their own destruction held in check by nothing more than the decision of one tired human woman. Because we were not fighting to be the most powerful species in the galaxy, she said. She turned to the ambassador and smiled, and it was a sad smile but a real one. We were fighting to be the kind of species that deserves to be. The ambassador did not fully understand what she meant, not then, but over the years that followed, as humanity took its place among the stars not as conquerors or victims, but as something entirely new, the words began to make sense. Humanity had faced the darkness and had chosen not to become it. And that, more than any weapon or fleet or ancient alien superweapon, was what made them extraordinary. The galaxy would never forget it.